Nothing in this podcast is meant for medical advice. Please discuss your own healthcare with your healthcare providers. Thank you. Welcome to your B-side, your midlife metamorphosis. I'm your host, Dr. Amy Lindsey. Midlife is not a crisis, it's a catalyst to your best life. Join me each week for a dose of mental, physical, and spiritual health, life, grief, adventure, and opportunity. It's time to flip the record over. Welcome to your B-side, midlife metamorphosis for all genders. I'm your host, Dr. Amy Lindsey. When I was 10 years old, my older brother, at 18 years old, was killed by an avalanche while snowboarding in mountains near our home. And just 2 months prior, I had been sitting in my Sunday school class listening to my new hero, a 27-year-old single woman who told tales of climbing and summiting Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa. She not only inspired me, but she planted that seed of a dream inside of me. Now, 2 months later, my brother died in the mountains, and I made a decision that mountains weren't safe, and I buried my dream along with my brother. At the time, I didn't understand the levels of fear that grief brings with it, that in the face of tragedy, the fear can have us shut down and move us into despair. As I've moved on in my life and processed a lot of my grief, I've come to understand the other side of grief, that grief can bring a clarity of purpose, of what is important, what matters in this life. Now, when we are in acute grief, which is the time just after we lose someone to death, and it can last days, weeks, months, depending on the relationship, it may even last a couple of years. And in that acute phase, there is this gift of clarity. It seems that everything else doesn't matter, and except for the clarity of what does matter in our lives. And it seems that everyone else is still just going about their lives with things that don't matter. When we're in acute grief, nothing seems to make sense. Traffic lights don't make sense. It seems like, don't they know this person who I love so dearly just died? Why are you still just changing on a timer? It doesn't make sense that people are honking at people when they merge lanes. It doesn't make sense that people are still waking up and going to jobs that they don't like and that are unfulfilling. It doesn't make sense. Nothing seems to make sense when you're in the midst of acute grief. And acute grief is exhausting, because everyone we seem to know is asking the questions about what happened. And as we retell the story, we relive the tragedy, and it's exhausting us emotionally, physically, spiritually. And it's almost like they're looking for a hidden message about how this person died to prevent themselves or the people they love dying. And in their shock and horror, as they listen to our story, we end up caretaking them. Acute grief is exhausting. When I was only 10 years old and my brother Brad was killed while snowboarding in an avalanche at the young age of 18, I remember after we took a whole week off to grieve and have the funeral, and then I went back to school. And I remember walking into the 5th grade, and I felt like everybody was staring at me. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but I did acknowledge that there was a shift in the dynamics between me and the other 10 and 11-year-olds. That it was almost like if someone sat next to me, they would catch getting a dead sibling, like it was a virus of some sort. You could feel the fear in that room. I was the only one at the age of 10 that I knew who had lost somebody to death, besides maybe an older grandparent or great aunt or something. As adults, we take on this fear of death. And like I mentioned just a second ago, we then almost interrogate people we know when they lose someone. We're trying to, almost like we're subconsciously or consciously trying to get to the bottom of it so that it doesn't happen to us. And here's the thing. It is going to happen to us. We all know that somewhere. We all know that death is for certain and that tomorrow is never promised. If you know somebody in acute grief, they've just lost something. Here's some do's and don'ts. So reach out to them, text them, call them, leave them messages, and let them know how much you love them, how much you're thinking of them, how sorry you are for their loss. And also, this is the most important part, make sure you also put in your message, you do not have to write me back. You do not have to respond. Just know I'm thinking about you. Hey, this is Dr. Amy Lindsey, your host of Welcome to Your B-Side, your midlife metamorphosis YouTube channel and podcast. If you want to be more involved with my B-Side community, you can join on School. That's SKOOL. You can join my school community. Look me up, Dr. Amy Lindsey, Welcome to Your B-Side, and request to join. Number 2, don't. Don't ever bring up someone you've lost when someone is in acute grief. When someone's in acute grief and they are telling you about the death of someone very close to them, do not bring up the death of someone close to you 8 years ago. It's not helping. While maybe a year from now, that can cause connection and understanding between the two of you, and you can both talk about loss and grief together. When someone's in acute grief, they just need you to listen. They just need a friend. They don't need to also then start wondering about how you're doing about your grandfather who died 8 years ago. Do buy them groceries, bring them dinner, walk their dog, take their children out of the house and take them somewhere, take out their garbage, fuel up their car, mow their lawn. When people are in acute grief, daily necessary routines and projects that they have to do have to get done. But when you're in acute grief, it seems so exhausting and impossible just to do those things. You don't even have to ask, hey, what can I do for you? Just let them know, I'm coming over and I'm bringing you groceries. I'm coming over and I'm bringing you dinner. Maybe even set up a meal train for them. Don't try to tell them that God has a bigger plan, that this death of their loved one is meant to be, and that something, good will come out of this. Not when people are in acute grief. You can think that for yourself, or you can go through your own healing and your own sense of purpose as you process your own grief, and everybody will at some point. And when people have made it beyond that stage of acute grief, then those conversations can start being appropriate. But when someone's in acute grief, it's not helpful. So beyond acute grief, we then start to incorporate grief into our lives. And here's the thing, grief is forever. It's not something we get over one day. It's now part of the fabric of our entire being. It's something that we will make room for in our lives. As we integrate the grief into our lives, one of the benefits of that acute grief that we can try to gain the knowledge of is that crystal clear clarity that we had. And it's almost like once we start getting on with our lives and our routines, it's like the curtain closes and we forget that clarity that we had during that time. And often, if our grief isn't cultivated, if our grief isn't integrated well, if we're not still processing it and doing all the things that we can do to continue to care for it, we can fall into despair. And grief can turn into that fear that stops us in the face of our tragedy. In midlife is the perfect time to start really caring for our grief, caring for it like you would care for any other part of your health. Grief can become what I like to call a superpower, especially in midlife. Grief can be a gift. It can be a portal to love. It can be a portal to that clarity I've been talking about. It can be that portal to purpose. And on your B side, you have permission to alchemize your pain into purpose. And you can see that your grief can be the fuel and the very reason for your life. When my brother died when I was 10 years old, I did go into despair for a long time. And I was on the brink of puberty at that point. And then as I went into puberty and adolescence, you better believe that I was in pit of despair of my own, that I wasn't given tools to process the grief. I came from a religious family, and we would go to church and we would learn about all the things that we were supposed to do in order to go to heaven again. And I was told that if I was a good girl and I did these things, then I would see my brother one day. But no one was helping me through loss and grief. That is different. The promises of heaven through religious dogma is a very different set of information than what to do with your grief. I didn't understand how to alchemize pain into purpose. I didn't understand how to be okay feeling the way that I was feeling. And so I spent much of my adolescence in that despair and that stopping. And throughout my life, and I think throughout many of our lives, we often use the death of the people we love as a reason to stop. But here's the opportunity, especially in midlife. We're going to flip that record over on grief, and that we're going to find your B side of grief. And that grief is that superpower, and it is that reason to pursue joy and love and your B side. So grief is a commonly missed diagnosis. As a doctor in my practice, I see this all the time. People come to me with depression and anxiety, and I immediately ask them about their grief. How is their grief? Have they lost anyone recently? Have they lost anyone ever? And grief has a very different timbre to it than depression and all the different kinds of depression and anxiety. Grief needs to be dealt with as its own gift and despair that it is, because it's both. As a medical community and as a society, I would call for us to always ask about people's grief, because grief doesn't just impact us emotionally and with our mental health, it also impacts our physical health. So, people who have either acute grief or compounded grief or unprocessed grief, they often can suffer from things like irritable bowel syndrome and maldigestion. They can have weakened immune systems. They can have heart palpitations and other cardiac symptoms. They can have chronic pain. So they can have sleep disorders. So sometimes the root cause of that is unprocessed grief. And yet we're going around treating these symptoms without understanding the loss and the pain that someone is feeling. When someone dies, it rocks our world and it rocks us to the core. And that impacts every aspect of our being. That impacts our emotional state, our mental state, our intellectual state. It impacts our physical state. So here's what I'm going to offer. In midlife, if you haven't been doing this already, I highly recommend you bring in caring for your grief into part of your health routine. I recommend doing it once a week for an hour. Block it out in your calendar, schedule your grief. And here's some ideas. You can spend some time journaling, just getting it out. Emotions are energy in motion, and so they need to move, and they need to move out of you. You need the movement. Spend some time journaling about how you're feeling now, how you were feeling then, what new thoughts or ideas about the losses of different people are coming up for you at this point in your life, and just spend some time journaling about your sadness. Or maybe you're not feeling sad anymore, but maybe you're curious. It's been almost 40 years since my brother was killed in that avalanche, and I still get sad about it these days, but often I have this curiosity, like this respectful curiosity of what his life could have been or what our relationship would be at this point in our lives, in our midlife. You can look at photos and go down memory lane. Just spend some time going down in memory lane. Laugh, cry, look at photos. You could take a walk in nature and just, again, get that movement going. Maybe you could walk somewhere that was a place that you used to go with that person, or get in your car and drive there if that was a special place to you. Maybe it's a special restaurant. Maybe it's a special place where you would go hiking. Go there. Write a letter to them. Write a letter to people you have lost. It might even sound silly, like, how are you doing? Dead and buried in the ground, or cremated, or whatever, but you could just tell them you miss them. Maybe you could ask for their forgiveness. Maybe you could offer your forgiveness to them. Often people die before we have found common ground in our relationship. Often people die and we haven't had these conversations of coming back together through forgiveness. Listen to music that they loved, or listen to music that helps soothe that pain for you. Often there are different songs, lyrics or not, that are so helpful when we're grieving, because often an artist can put into poetry of their song how we're feeling, and we were having a hard time articulating it. So listening to music is one of the best ways to take care of our grief. Start with this weekly ritual and care for it as much as you would care for any other health routine that you have in your life. So now let's flip the record over on your grief, your B-side of your grief. And grief, allow that superpower to connect you to your purpose, because grief connects you to your soul. And soul work is the most important work at this point in our lives. Enter that portal that grief brings, that portal of love, that portal of clarity of what's important to you, that portal of forgiveness, that portal of purpose. Remember that clarity and use it to fuel your goals and dreams. Start with what are some of your goals and dreams. Find that purpose and start living from there, creating and designing your life from that place, no longer in status quo. Remember that clarity. Some of that status quo seemed ridiculous when we'd recently lose somebody, because that's the truth, is that some of it is ridiculous, and that what we're doing here and what is important for our total health, mental, physical, spiritual health, all of it connected, is living out some of those goals and dreams. So grief is your superpower, and you have the permission to alchemize your pain into purpose. What will you create? Who will you love better? How will your relationship with forgiveness? What do you dream of doing with this precious life? Death is just as ordinary as birth, and both are extraordinary. We will all be born. Here we are. And we will all die. That is ordinary. That is an ordinary, common, most basic common denominator human experience. And yet both are the most miraculous, extraordinary things in our life and death. Birth is a miracle, and death is too. Just like birth and death, death is extraordinary because it reminds us of why we're alive in the first place, to follow our dreams and live a life that we love. What will you do with your one precious life. This has been another episode of Welcome to Your B-Side, your midlife metamorphosis with Dr. Amy Lindsey. Be sure to follow along and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. See you next time.